Welcome to the Unlist. Today we're talking about Italian fragrances. For men, of course. Mostly men's fragrances. Why Italian fragrances? Well, I feel like Italian fragrances, especially men's fragrances, have a sort of world unto themselves. Effect, at least. Beyond the big names, right? Gucci, Versace, Giorgio Armani, it seems like there are a lot of Italian brands that, at least until recent years, went entirely unloved. It's almost as if all these Italian brands were in their own little walled garden like this. All of them are in here, including the ones that some of you may not have ever heard of, like Basile and Gianmarco Venturi, brands like that. They're all in this garden here with this wall around it. And the only people who are allowed in this garden are actual Italians. So people from Italy know about these brands. Italian Americans in places like New York and Chicago know about these brands, but everyone else, no. It seems a bit weird. And even though I was only a little kid in the 80s, I can vouch for that, because when I was a kid, I don't remember seeing ads for Gianfranco Ferre, Gianmarco Venturi, Sergio Tacchini. I just don't remember any of these brands getting any kind of substantial attention. I don't remember seeing any of these brands with commercials, ads in magazines, none of that stuff. I mean, Armani, yeah. And in the 90s, Versace, yeah, got really big. Gucci also got big, but Gucci didn't get big until after, the poor guy was killed. Maurizio Gucci was killed, and then, that whole thing became a big media blitz. But prior to that, even Gucci wasn't super on the map in the 80s. In the 70s, maybe, they had a big thing in the 70s with all the prints and stuff. But in the 80s, not so much. So, what happened? I don't really know. Honestly, I don't know why Italian fragrances seem to be kind of in their own little exclusive world. Or at least they were, like I said, until recent decades with the internet and social media and Twitter and Instagram and YouTube and you name it. Now every brand gets its own Andy Warhol style 15 minutes of fame, but back in those days that wasn't the case. And it's just interesting to see how that ended up being like that, how all these fragrances and brands released products that were bought and sold by the ethnic group in question, but the masses didn't really get much attention, weren't given a chance to give them attention if they wanted to. I guess it wasn't until Acqua di Gio, honestly, that I knew what Armani was. Didn't know what Armani was in the 80s. So, barely knew what Versace was. So what happened? I want to leave that question to you. Those of you who are boomers or later Gen Xers who were teenagers in the 80s, those of you who were older than me that maybe had their ear to the ground a little better than 6-7-year-old me did, right? I want some of you to be like, hey, yeah, this is why. This is why you never heard these brands. Like, if you have insight on it. Maybe you're an Italian, right? You grew up in New York, New Jersey, Brooklyn, somewhere, Chicago. You can lend some insight. Yeah, these were kind of hush-hush. They were between us. We didn't really share this stuff with people. Or just flat out be like, yeah, well, it's because the French bombarded the media. I mean, it's easy to see that half of all the perfume ads were Dior or Chanel or YSL back then, right? That was half of all the perfume ads. Or American brands with a lot of cash, like Ralph Lauren with all the polo ads, Calvin Klein with all the ads for Eternity Obsession, Estee Lauder with all the Aramis ads. Maybe that's what it was. There was no room left for the Italian brands to get any ads on TV or in magazines. I don't know. Again, leaving that to you guys. Maybe you can answer it for me. But the entire Italian diaspora of men's fragrances, going all the way back to the 40s, guys, right? Acqua di Parma is different because that's traditional cologne, turn of the century. It got widespread recognition, so it's different. But outside of Acqua di Parma, most Italian brands were kind of under the radar, really, until the big mainstream ones broke out. So even the drugstore stuff like Aqua di Selva, Pinot Silvestri, those things remained very much under the radar for a lot of people. They didn't learn what those were until the internet, you know, almost a century after the fact, you know. But anyhow, now that we've gone over that, let's talk a little bit about the styles, the prevailing styles. Now, one thing I noticed in particular about Italian men's fragrances that has always stood out to me is not so much about the way they are built with what they include, but the way they are built with what they avoid. I find that most fragrances from different countries, you can kind of tell what their favorite materials are. You know, Middle Eastern fragrances play with rose, they play with incense, they play with ambers, and, you know, and recently oud has become a bigger deal, but that's what they have in them, not what they exclude, right? Everything else is kind of anything goes. Same thing with British fragrances. Traditionally, classic British brands, Flores, D.R. Harris, G.O.F. Trumper, Penhaligon's, the Crown Perfumery when they were still around, all those brands, British designers like Burberry, okay? So, more often than not, those brands display a certain dryness, a certain conservative appeal. They don't like to really be sweet or heavily musky or very bright. They prefer more powdery, more bracing, things that feel more held back, right? But that doesn't stop them from being rose or being, again, incense or amber or whatever. There's no limit to the palette being used. It's just the execution is what makes it feel British. It's the execution of the materials, more so than the materials. And then the French, well, obviously, the French being the biggest players, they kind of use everything. But even then, you can say ostensibly French fragrances try to be very sophisticated, very complex. They tend to have designs that showcase abstract concepts like the fougere, the chypre, the oriental. They tend to have very almost painfully intricate artistic styles. You can argue against that with modern fragrances, but let's be honest, all modern fragrances seem to be very commercialized these days. It doesn't matter whether it's a Spanish name or an Italian name or an American name or a British name or a French name. The corporate globalization of fragrance in general has made a lot of things feel homogenized, but I'm talking from a historical context. Regions have their own flavor, even if the palette is still wide open. You know, again, American fragrances, very loud, extroverted, attention grabbing, but same thing, rose, incense, lavender, it's all good in the hood. Italian fragrances, key difference. With men's fragrances, they almost always avoid animalic musks. They almost always avoid noticeable floral elements. And they almost always avoid heavy spices. So you will be very pained to find a traditional Italian men's fragrance that is spicy, very musky, or very floral. And also no sweetness. Like zero sweetness. And it wouldn't change until the 90s with Acqua di Gio, okay, with these more mass appealing Versace fragrances like Blue Jeans, okay. Wouldn't be until the 90s that that would change. But from that point on back, you could almost define men's Italian fragrances by what they didn't use instead of what they use or how they execute what they use. It's what they avoided. And you could find a musky or a spicy Italian men's fragrance, but it would be an outlier, okay? It would be over here in the corner, ostracized from the rest. I will name some of those examples, okay, to prove you that It's not an absolute. There are exceptions. I will name those exceptions because I love you guys and that's what I do. So going all the way back to the 40s with the big notable chem houses pumping out the first Italian drugstore fragrances, the first post-war fragrances, stuff like Acqua di Selva by Visconti di Madrone, later named Victor for American audiences, although they've always been Visconti di Madrone in Italy. But over here, we knew them for a while as Victor. Then they switched back to their actual name. They stopped Anglicizing the word. They didn't stop doing that. It just went to Visconti di Madrone. If you can't pronounce it, that's on you, right? No more Victor. We're done with the Victor nonsense. So, but Acqua di Selva was the first real, like, noteworthy example of a mainstream Italian men's fragrance. And it had an aftershave just called aftershave. I don't know why the aftershave isn't called Acqua di Selva, but it's the same font letters, but it just says aftershave on it. So Victor or Visconti di Madrone aftershave, but it's Acqua di Selva. They have it in a shaved cream as well, and a bar soap and all that fun stuff. Full men's grooming range, okay, for this stuff. Very, very lucid, very lifelike fougere accord with a focus on pine, bergamot, and lavender. No sweetness, not a lot of tonka, okay, mostly pine here, guys. Gotta like pine or stay away from this one. But very bright, very lively, and very, very, very fucking dry. Like Sahara Desert dry. Crawling across hot coals for just a drop of water, kind of dry. Okay, that's how dry this fragrance is. Pinot Silvestre, which would come a few years later in '55, would buy Vidal originally. Lino Vidal was the original house for it. Now it's somebody else, but same sort of deal. Fougere construction, big focus on pine, even bigger focus on pine actually than Acqua di Selva had a bit more sophistication with a big bergamot note, had herbs in it, very noticeable herbs. Lavender was very much, geranium was very much in the mix. Pinot Silvestre just takes all of that and just squishes it, and it goes pine, 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 pine. Yes, just like that. And to even further let you know that it is pine, they put it in a fucking pine cone. It's a pine cone bottle, guys, with a screw top if it's a splash, or it's got a built-in sprayer, you know, if it's a spray bottle, but it looks like a literal pine cone. So they really wanted you to know this is a pine fragrance. I mean, Pinot Silvestre, okay, pine forest. But again, very dry, very aromatic. Classic in my opinion. Some folks think it smells like a Christmas tree and they won't go anywhere near it. I disagree with those folks because I've owned Christmas trees, you know, natural ones. I'm more of an artificial guy myself, but I've had real Christmas trees, and none of those reminded me of a bottle of Pinot, okay? None of them did. So I don't know what kind of Christmas trees you guys have where they smell like a bottle of Pinot, but hey, man, our noses are all different. I'm not going to judge. Well, I am judging you, but you know, I'm being polite about it. So moving right along into the 60s, we would see some things. Brioni would get into the game. Don't know what their fragrances smelled like because they were a very limited batch and they were here and gone. But they had some stuff back then. And then Roberto Capucci got into the game with some early fragrances like Sang Royal, Capucci Pour Homme. Capucci Pour Homme felt to me like it was trying to compete with the French fragrances. So it could also be called a bit of an outlier because it has a very French sense of style. It's a very chypre composition that seems very dialed in to being almost an academic exercise of aromatic chypre craft. So if you were to put Roberto Capucci in a Givenchy bottle and call it, you know, Monsieur de Givenchy, you know, Second Coming or something, or make it a flanker, I'd believe you. You know, it could sit right alongside Chanel Pour Monsieur. It could sit right alongside Monsieur Lanvin. It could sit right alongside Monsieur de Givenchy, Moustache by Rochas, Spanish house. YSL Pour Homme from 71, Balenciaga Ho Hong. It could sit alongside all of those. And it belongs in that little cadre of citrus aromatic chypre fragrances. The only thing that really makes the Capucci Pour Homme feel Italian at all is the leather note. Because if pine is a big deal for Italian fragrances, leather is the other one. You will find time and 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 time again that if it isn't pine, it's leather. Or it's pine. Or it's both. Both. Pine and leather in the same fragrance? Ah, yes. Basil Uomo has your number if you want pine and leather together in the same fragrance. So that one's from 87, by the way. But yes, they are all about the pine and all about the leather. No florals, again, no vanilla, no sweetness, no big, heavy civet, slap in the face, musk, none of that. We're not doing that. We're not doing the big ambers and the resins here. We're not doing the big chewy bases that smell gummy or sweet or musky. We're not doing the big rose, none of that stuff. No tuberose, if you want that, you need to go talk to a Frenchman because the Italians want no parts of that. At least not until, like I said, the 90s, 2000s, things changed. But the traditional stuff, no. It's pine, it's leather, it's herbs, it's citrus, it's oak moss, or it's go fuck yourself. Because you're not getting it, right? They put the foot down just like that. And honestly, even though I typically get on people for having a limited worldview, I get on people with a limited taste or a sense of style. The flip side of the coin, because there's always two sides to every coin, right? The flip side is I've got to admire that kind of doubling down. When you have a certain national aesthetic, right? Or a certain cultural vibe that so permeates that it's kind of standard, you can expect it, right? You have to admire that. It's like, no, if you want an Italian man's fragrance, God damn it, you are not getting florals, you are not getting musks. You are getting pine and you are getting leather, and you're going to eat that or you're going to go to bed hungry, mister. That is literally how it is. And it echoes. It echoes through the 70s, it echoes through the 80s, and in the first half of the 90s, right? I said right up until Acqua di Gio, right up until Blue Jeans, all of those fragrances changed the game for Italian brands. Italian brands became a little more worldly, right? They became a little more worldly after that. But before that, very much this. And the women's fragrances could get their own video. Same sort of limited palette. The women's fragrances from the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, all the Italian brands had a very limited palette. The way things were done, it was very much, these are your options. Stay within these lines, or you're banished to the wastelands, and off you go, like in Mad Max, okay? That's how it was. No exceptions, very few. The ones that were typically ignored. Like I said, Roberto Capucci did come out with a very spicy, musky fragrance called Punjab in the late 70s that didn't do that well, and it's kind of like under rug swept. I like it, but it is a bit of a red herring. It is a bit of the black sheep, the stepchild, if you say. So, but then Gucci Pour Homme from 76. Again, Gucci Pour Homme, very much in that Italian aesthetic, the herbs, the sandalwood, a bit thicker, a bit heavier, as we're getting into the PowerHouse era, right? The PowerHouse makes a big change because once we get into the PowerHouse era, the Italians' fragrances get a bit bolder, but they have to. They get bolder because they have to conform to the standard of the day. So some of the brands kept making light fragrances. Armani Eau Pour Homme from 84 was very light. Like Roberto Capucci Pour Homme from 67. Very light, very aromatic, citrus chypre, not very dense, very just gentlemanly, But most cases, they kept the Italian aesthetic, but then they just added the fatter base notes. And we would see that into the 80s with my next fragrance. The only one I have a bottle to show you because I'm wearing the scent today. And it's Enrico Coveri Pour Homme. This is another herbal Italian herbal blast. If you don't like clary sage, don't go near this. So, not very expensive, not very well loved outside of its hardcore fans, but it is definitely a clary sage bomb. If you like clary sage and castoreum, you'll like this. But if you don't like musk and clary sage, you have no business going near this. You will be disappointed. Just going to lay that out there. Then we see Gianfranco Fair Forman, another very dry, woody, sandalwood, bergamot. Again, Italians love being in that woody, herbal zone. It's almost like they all want to be lumberjacks, right? All these fragrances want to be lumberjacks. They want to put the flannel on and have the axe and the little hat with the flaps, and they want to get you in the log cabin up in the Alps somewhere, or maybe in the American Midwest to give you a pickup truck and a mud road that goes over a creek or something, and you've got John Denver playing in the background. That's what they want, okay? I don't know why, but it's what they want. And then Arte Capucci was just like that, very mossy. Actually, those of you guys out there who worship oak moss so much, put your money where your mouth is and get you a bottle of Arte Capucci, one of the mossiest fragrances I have ever smelled. It's like you're just shoving your face into a tree, okay? And then we keep going. We go into the late 80s. We see stuff like Gian Marco Venturi. I already mentioned Basil Uomo. It's leather and pine together in a bottle, and it's good, but again, you have to be into that. A little bit of jasmine in there, but the jasmine doesn't really play a role of being jasmine. It plays a role of boosting those aromatics, so you barely perceive it as jasmine. It's more like just it's there to push the green stuff forward. So, but Basil Uomo, very good. Just keeps going into the 90s. Versace, their original L'Homme from 84 was also very citrus. Another outlier, it does have a bit of a civet note to it, but honestly, I feel like the civet there is not really the star of the show. Once again, it's there to push the leather agenda, the pine, the bergamot. Okay, that's what's going on. And then Dolce & Gabbana, 1994. This is where we will cap it off. Dolce & Gabbana, clean bergamot, tobacco, oak moss. Once again, no big fat musks, okay? Nothing animalic. No sweetness, very little sweetness. A little tiny bit of vanilla. Just enough vanilla to round off the tobacco, okay? But no big florals, just lavender, okay? That's all you get. It is mainly about citrus. It is about tobacco, and it is about that dry, woody, clean, white shirt, black suit, get in my Ferrari and drive off. That is what it is about. So that is the ostensible Italian style, at least again until aquatics and all that stuff took over. So there you go, guys. Some of my favorite Italian fragrances. There are a lot of modern ones that I didn't talk about, like all the Valentino stuff that's been coming out the pipe lately, all the different Born in Roma and Ice Cream Dream and Vanilla Popsicle Nightmare and all that stuff. But we don't talk about that stuff on this channel, do we? We try to avoid that stuff. So let me know what some of your favorite Italian men's fragrances are, and if you have any cultural knowledge that you can clue me in on about why they were so kind of kept so under the radar for so long, I'd like to know. But thank you for watching, and hopefully you enjoy.